Organizers expect millions of people to take part in a third round of the No Kings protests across the country today. Organizers say the rallies are intended to show opposition to President Trump's policies, as well as the war in Iran. Nearly 7 million people attended No Kings protests last fall. This one's expected to be even bigger. Joining me now for more is co-president of Public Citizen, Lisa Gilbert. Lisa, it is good to see you. Thank you for being here. How are people preparing for today's events? How many people do you expect to march across the country?
Well, we have a record number of events, 3,300 around the country. To put that in perspective, there are only 3,150 counties in the whole nation. So there will be an event literally anywhere that you could hope to attend one. We will see RSVPs from folks in rural areas, in suburban areas, in urban areas. It's a true mass movement, and I'm expecting joyful protest, shared resolve as we all grapple with the realities of this authoritarian slide that we've been experiencing, this sort of wannabe dictator persona that Trump has adopted as he moves us into an illegal war.
Hey friends, welcome. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? Millions of Americans are in the streets for the third wave of a sustained, organized movement under one banner: No Kings. Not a single protest that fades by morning, a rapidly accelerating movement in cities too numerous to ignore, with numbers too vast for Capitol Hill to dismiss as fringe.
Today, protesters across this country took to the streets as part of the latest No Kings demonstration against President Trump and his administration. Among the biggest rallies right there in St. Paul, Minnesota, outside the state capitol. CBS's Christian Benavidez is in West Palm Beach, Florida, near the president's home. Christian.
Jerika, this is the third round of No Kings protests. Organizers say that they expect these crowds to be the largest. And in that Minnesota rally, officials there prepared for a crowd of over 150,000 people.
The message is simple, and it cuts through every spin cycle. They believe the president has crossed the line that separates an elected leader from something far more dangerous. And that message, written on signs held by millions of bodies in public squares across the country, is one no press secretary can translate away.
That's right, guys. We're talking about the sights, the sounds, the signs, and most importantly, the passions of the people. It's the No Kings rally from right here in Washington, D.C. Thousands of demonstrators gathered on Saturday morning at Memorial Circle in Arlington, Virginia, with a desire to have their collective voices heard. Protesters were armed with signs, with slogans, with banners expressing their displeasure with President Trump as well as his administration. Now the march, it began at 10 a.m. as the droves in attendance sang and chanted in unity for their common cause. And in what was described as a powerful moment, the march matriculated across the Memorial Bridge, moving from Virginia into the nation's capital.
Major news organizations across the globe have turned their cameras toward the American streets. The images are striking. In New York City, the crowds stretch for blocks, a sea of humanity moving with a singular purpose. In Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, and the nation's capital itself, the story is the same.
While Americans gathered at more than 3,000 No Kings protests around the country.
He promised no new wars. He promised to be the America First president, and this sure does not look like that.
Protests were also held worldwide, including in Rome, Madrid, and Paris. The White House has dubbed the rallies Trump derangement therapy sessions.
This is not a mental therapy. This is showing them that we can be strong and we can have democracy again.
Among the largest crowds in Minnesota, where immigration enforcement reached a flashpoint earlier this year.
With everything that's going on, I feel powerless, and today, in this moment, I feel like I do have a little bit of power.
The rallies come as the president says he is looking to wind down the war with Iran.
The National Mall, that sacred space where history has been made by movements demanding civil rights and an end to unjust wars, is once again filled with citizens exercising their most fundamental First Amendment freedoms. They are assembling, they are speaking, and they are petitioning their government for a redress of grievances that they believe can no longer wait.
Hundreds of thousands marched today in No Kings rallies all across the country, including a huge march in downtown D.C. Those rallies were aimed at the Trump administration, with protests taking aim at everything from the war with Iran to the higher cost of living. The march in D.C. crossed the Memorial Bridge in Arlington and marched along the mall.
The grievance is not a single policy or a single bill. It is the accumulation of actions that, when viewed together, paint a portrait of an executive branch that has systematically attempted to place itself beyond the reach of the courts, beyond the authority of Congress, and beyond the accountability of the people. The protesters are not merely unhappy, they are alarmed, and they have chosen to make their alarm visible on a scale that forces every elected official in Washington to take notice. The third wave designation is critically important to understanding the trajectory of this movement. This is not a spontaneous outburst that will quickly burn itself out. The first wave rose early in the administration as citizens reacted to the initial shock of aggressive executive actions. The second wave, which crested months ago, demonstrated that the anger was not subsiding. Over 100,000 people filled the streets of New York City alone during that prior mobilization, a number that signaled a movement with deep roots and significant organizational capacity. And now this third wave has arrived, and by every available metric, it is larger, more coordinated, and more intense than what came before. The energy is not dissipating, it is compounding. Each new controversy, each new revelation of executive overreach, each new policy that inflicts pain on ordinary families adds another layer of fuel to a fire that is now burning with sustained intensity. The movement has reached a critical mass where it can no longer be ignored or dismissed by the political class. The specific grievances that have brought these millions into the streets span the full spectrum of the administration's most controversial actions. There is the matter of immigration enforcement, which has taken on a tragic and deeply personal dimension. The names Renee Nicole Good and Alex Priddy have become rallying cries. These were American citizens whose lives were cut short during an immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota. The precise circumstances of their deaths remain the subject of investigation and heated debate, but the core fact is undeniable. 2 Americans died in the course of an enforcement action driven by the administration's aggressive deportation agenda. For the families of the deceased, for the communities that knew them, and for the protesters who now carry their names on signs and chant them in the streets, these deaths are not abstract statistics. They are evidence of a system that has prioritized the projection of force over the protection of human life. The protesters demand accountability. They want to know who gave the orders, who set the rules of engagement, and who will be held responsible for the loss of American life. Then there is the matter of war. The Constitution is explicit on this point. The power to declare war resides with the Congress of the United States. Yet this administration launched a major military campaign without seeking or receiving congressional authorization. The conflict with Iran, which was supposed to be a swift and decisive demonstration of American power, has instead become a quagmire. American service members have died. The strategic objectives remain unfulfilled. Gas prices, a daily and painful reminder of the conflict's economic consequences, have surged, placing an enormous burden on working families who must fill their tanks to get to work and take their children to school. The protesters see this war as the ultimate expression of an imperial presidency, a president who believes he can send young Americans into harm's way on his sole authority, without debate, without a vote, and without accountability. And when the threats of annihilation against civilian populations were broadcast to the world, the protesters heard the language of a tyrant, not the measured words of a commander-in-chief constrained by the laws of armed conflict. The economic pain that ordinary Americans are experiencing provides the backdrop for all of this outrage. The president campaigned on a promise of affordability. He spoke directly to working families who were struggling with the cost of groceries, the cost of housing, and the cost of simply getting by. Yet those same families look at their receipts at the supermarket and see prices that remain stubbornly high. They look at the gas station and see numbers that eat away at their paychecks. And they look at the news and see reports of a $400 million ballroom project being pursued by the president using public resources for what appears to be personal vanity and political patronage. The gap between the rhetoric of fighting for the working class and the reality of policies that seem to benefit the wealthy and the well-connected while squeezing everyone else is a chasm that the protesters are determined to highlight. The effigies of the president and vice president that have been set ablaze at these rallies are not merely acts of symbolic protest. They are visceral expressions of a belief that the leaders of the country have betrayed the trust placed in them by the people who elected them. The White House response to this massive outpouring of Democratic participation has been, to put it charitably, dismissive. The protests have been characterized as therapy sessions for individuals suffering from an irrational obsession. The suggestion has been floated that only paid journalists and professional agitators could possibly care about the issues being raised. This is the rhetoric of an administration that has chosen to live in an alternate reality, a bubble where the millions of Americans who are peacefully assembling to voice their concerns simply do not exist or are not legitimate. This response does not diffuse the tension, it amplifies it. When citizens are exercising their most sacred constitutional rights and the response from the pinnacle of power is mockery and denial, it confirms the very critique that the protesters are making. It proves in their minds that the president views the people not as his employers to whom he is accountable, but as subjects to be managed or ignored. The claim that the opposition is manufactured or paid for is a classic tactic of authoritarian leaders seeking to delegitimize dissent. And its deployment by this White House has only served to validate the No Kings framing of the entire movement. Let us examine the anatomy of this protest movement with the care it deserves, because understanding its components is essential to understanding its potential impact. The name No Kings is not a random slogan. It is a direct invocation of the American founding. The revolution that gave birth to this nation was fought, first and foremost, against the concept of monarchy. The framers of the Constitution designed a system of government with multiple competing branches specifically to prevent the concentration of power in a single individual. The presidency was created with significant powers, but those powers were always meant to be checked by the legislative and judicial branches. The protesters are making a specific constitutional argument. They are arguing that the current occupant of the Oval Office has rejected this foundational principle. They point to the systematic disregard for court orders. They point to the unilateral launch of military action without congressional consent. They point to the use of executive authority to punish political enemies and reward loyalists. And they conclude that this pattern of behavior is not merely aggressive executive action. It is the behavior of someone who believes he is a king. The deaths of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretty have become the human face of this constitutional crisis. The details, as they have emerged from various reports, paint a troubling picture. An immigration raid was conducted. A confrontation ensued. And two Americans, individuals whose status as citizens should have placed them squarely within the protective embrace of the Constitution's guarantees, were killed. For the protesters, this is the inevitable consequence of an enforcement-first, rights-last approach to immigration. When the rhetoric from the top dehumanizes entire communities and encourages aggressive tactics, the likelihood of tragic outcomes increases. The families of Good and Pretty are not just grieving, they are demanding answers. And the protesters have embraced their cause, carrying their names and their stories as a shield against the administration's attempts to frame the immigration debate purely in terms of law and order. The human cost, the protesters insist, must be part of the calculation. The burning of effigies is a form of political theater with deep historical roots. From the burning of King George III in the streets of colonial America, to the protests against various unpopular leaders throughout history, the act of setting fire to a likeness carries a specific symbolic weight. It is a declaration that the individual represented has forfeited their legitimacy. It is a public rejection of their authority. When protesters set fire to representations of the president and vice president, they are not merely expressing anger, they are performing a ritual of symbolic removal. They are saying, in the most visually arresting way possible, that these individuals are not fit to hold the offices they occupy. The images of those flames, captured on countless cell phone cameras and broadcast across social media, are seared into the public consciousness. They are the indelible images of this movement, the visual shorthand for a nation in revolt against its own leadership. The call for criminal prosecution adds another layer to the protesters' demands. They are not satisfied with removal from office through the political mechanisms of impeachment or the 25th Amendment. They believe that the conduct in question rises to the level of criminality. They point to the threats of civilizational annihilation as potential war crimes. They point to the obstruction of justice inherent in the firing of officials who refuse to carry out illegal orders. They point to the potential corruption symbolized by the Ballroom Project, and they are demanding that the justice system, once the political obstacles are cleared, hold the president accountable as any other citizen would be held accountable for violating the law. This demand for criminal accountability reflects a belief that the misconduct is not merely a political difference of opinion, but a fundamental breach of the social contract. The organizational infrastructure required to produce 3 successive waves of mass mobilization on this scale should not be underestimated. This is not a handful of people with a Facebook page. This is a sophisticated, distributed network of organizers who have learned from previous social movements. They coordinate across cities. They navigate the complex permitting processes required for large demonstrations. They arrange for sound systems, portable restrooms, and medical support. They develop unified messaging that resonates across different demographic groups and geographic regions. They recruit and train marshals to keep the peace and de-escalate potential conflicts. This level of organization suggests a movement with significant staying power. It is not dependent on the whims of a single charismatic leader. It is embedded in communities and capable of regenerating its energy after each wave of action. This infrastructure is a political asset that will not simply disappear after the next election. It will be deployed to register voters, to turn out the vote, and to hold elected officials accountable at the ballot box. The economic dimension of the protests is crucial to understanding their broad appeal. The president's approval ratings have suffered as the economic realities of his term have set in. The promises of immediate relief and a return to affordable abundance have not materialized. Instead, families are grappling with persistent inflation, high interest rates, and an uncertain job market. The report of negative job growth in a recent month sent a shockwave through the economic commentariat and confirmed the fears of many ordinary Americans that the economy is heading in the wrong direction. The protesters are connecting these economic hardships directly to the president's policy choices. The war in Iran, they argue, is a primary driver of elevated gas prices. The trade wars and tariff schemes, many of which have been struck down by the courts, have disrupted supply chains and raised costs for businesses and consumers. The overall climate of political chaos and constitutional instability, they contend, makes businesses hesitant to invest and hire. The economic pain is not an abstraction. It is felt in every trip to the grocery store and every glance at the retirement account, and the protesters are channeling that economic anxiety into a political demand for a change in leadership. The international dimension of the protests is also significant. The world is watching. When global news organizations like the BBC dedicate significant airtime and column inches to covering mass demonstrations in the United States, it sends a signal to allies and adversaries alike. It signals that the American political system is under severe strain. It signals that the president's grip on power, while still legally secure, is being contested in the streets by a substantial portion of the population. For allies who depend on American stability and reliability, these images are deeply unsettling. They raise questions about the long-term trajectory of American democracy and the credibility of American leadership on the global stage. For adversaries, the protests are a propaganda gift. They are evidence, which can be amplified by state-controlled media, that the American model is failing and that the United States is in no position to lecture other nations about democracy or human rights. The president, who cares deeply about his image and the perception of American strength, is being humiliated on the international stage by the very citizens he claims to lead. The impact of the protests on the legislative branch is already being felt. Members of Congress, particularly those in competitive districts, are acutely aware of the crowds in the streets. They see the signs, they hear the chants. They read the polling data that shows the president's approval rating stuck below 40% and the intensity of opposition growing. The protests create a permission structure for Republicans who have privately harbored concerns about the president's conduct to begin voicing those concerns publicly. When millions of constituents are marching under a No Kings banner, a Republican senator can justify a break with the president by pointing to the legitimate concerns of the people they represent. The protests provide political cover. They change the calculus of what is politically risky. In an environment where the base is energized and the opposition is mobilized, staying tethered to a sinking president may become more dangerous than cutting the line. The protests are accelerating the erosion of the president's political coalition. The pressure on the cabinet to consider the 25th Amendment is a direct, tangible goal of some elements of the protest movement. Demonstrations are not confined to the National Mall and the large public squares. They are also occurring in the neighborhoods where cabinet secretaries live. The tactic is designed to make the crisis personal. It is one thing to read about protests in a briefing memo. It is another thing entirely to have to navigate a crowd of demonstrators outside your own home, to have your spouse and children hear the chants demanding that you act to remove the president. This kind of direct personal pressure can have a profound psychological effect. It forces cabinet members to confront the reality that their service in this administration is not just a matter of policy debate, but a matter of intense moral and political contestation. It raises the personal stakes. And for a handful of cabinet members who may already harbor doubts about the president's fitness, this pressure could be the factor that tips them toward action. The possibility of violence is the dark shadow that hangs over every mass mobilization. The vast majority of protesters are peaceful. They are there to exercise their constitutional rights, not to engage in destruction. But large crowds in highly charged political environments create inherent risks. The presence of counter-protesters, the potential for agent provocateurs, the possibility of an overzealous or poorly trained law enforcement response, any of these factors could spark a confrontation that spirals out of control. If violence were to erupt, and especially if it resulted in serious injury or loss of life, the political calculus would shift dramatically. A crisis of that magnitude would create an overwhelming demand for a resolution. Congress might feel compelled to act immediately on impeachment. The cabinet might feel that invoking the 25th Amendment is the only way to restore order and prevent further bloodshed. The president himself might calculate that resigning is the only way to spare the nation from a deeper catastrophe. The protest movement operates in the shadow of this possibility, hoping to achieve its goals peacefully, but aware that the stakes are extraordinarily high. Here is the consolidated reality. The streets of America are filled with citizens who have concluded that the president is acting as a king rather than a public servant. They are mobilizing in waves, each larger than the last, under the banner of No Kings. The movement is fueled by a combination of constitutional alarm, economic pain, and the human cost of aggressive policies. The deaths of Americans during immigration enforcement operations have given the movement a powerful moral focal point. The president's response has been dismissive and contemptuous, which only serves to validate the protesters' critique. The movement is organized, sustained, and growing. It is creating political conditions that make it increasingly difficult for Republicans to maintain their unified support for the president. It is pressuring the cabinet directly. It is embarrassing the nation on the global stage. And it is building toward a confrontation that could fundamentally reshape the American political landscape heading into the next election cycle. The people are speaking. The question is no longer whether they are being heard. The question is what those in power will do in response.